will be presenting Sharing Our Experiences. Tonight's webinar is designed as a how-to guide for using your personal experience to tell a compelling story. This webinar will provide you with tools to select the types of experiences to share, as well as a framework that can help change hearts and minds about LGBTQ equality in the U.S. The Family Equality Council is the national organization that represents the 3 million LGBTQ parents in this country, as well as their children. We work to change hearts and minds, and we do that through our programs, events, and policy work. This evening, we'll be presenting this webinar in conjunction with Marriage Equality USA, and our presenter tonight is Mr. Charlie Scatamacchia. Charlie retired from the music publishing industry and spends his time working for many causes, including Marriage Equality USA. Since 1996, Marriage Equality USA's goal has been to empower each person to be their own best advocate for their legal and lived equality, specifically with respect to the freedom to marry. With over 40,000 members, as well as volunteer leaders and partner organizations in all 50 states, they have grown to be the largest grassroots organization of its kind, engaged in education, training, organizing, advocacy, and coalition building to win equal marriage rights and protections for LGBTQ couples and their children. This evening, we ask that if you have questions, you participate in our questions round, which is throughout the entire presentation. On your screens in your upper right-hand corner, there is a box, has little 6 boxes, creating one entire square. You click on that, you should see a Q&A little blue tab. If you click that Q&A tab, a box should appear in your right-hand corner. There you can insert your questions throughout the course of the presentation, and we ask that you submit those questions as you have them. So no need to worry until we say it's time for Q&A. You can go ahead and submit your questions, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to present to you Mr. Charlie Scatamacchia.
Welcome to Marriage Equality USA's Sharing Our Experience workshop, presented in partnership with Family Equality Council. As Ada told you, my name is Charlie Scatamacchia, and I'm a volunteer with MEUSA, and it's my pleasure to be with you here tonight. The goals for tonight's webinar are to explore our long history as storytellers, to talk about why stories matter, to provide elements of a good story, to describe a few types of marriage equality stories, and to describe opportunities for sharing stories beyond this webinar. I got involved with the marriage equality movement after my partner of 20 years passed away. Right around that time, the rhetoric from the political and religious right on the subject of gay marriage was sounding particularly harsh, at least to my ear. And that's when I decided I had to do something. And I knew that Marriage Equality USA was the organization to do it with. I knew I'd have to talk to Marriage Equality's executive director, Brian Silva, and I made several failed attempts to meet him. Then one day, when I was finishing my volunteer shift at a New York City hospital, who walked into the patient lounge but Brian Silva? I couldn't believe it. Brian was there visiting a sick friend. I offered my assistance with respect to his friend, and I asked if I could meet with him to discuss how I could get involved. And Brian recommended several things, but I wasn't any good at any of them. Until I met Brian's colleague, Tracy Hollister. Now, Tracy was working on The Heart of What Matters, a presentation geared towards explaining to people in the movable middle why support for marriage equality is growing so rapidly in this country. And storytelling is a big component of that presentation, and we discovered I have a talent for it. So fast forward, and here I am speaking to you today. At first, when I talked about the events I just related to you, I thought I was doing just that, just telling you about something that happened. I didn't realize I was telling a story. And it may seem naive, but I thought telling stories was something other people did, famous authors or well-known public speakers. I was just talking to people. But Brian and Tracy pointed out, and we'll see later, that storytelling is what we all do, though we may not realize it. When you signed up for this webinar, we asked you, what event happened in your life that caused you to become involved in the LGBTQ equality movement? And the answers you gave are like so many we've heard before and will continue to hear, I'm sure. Here are a few of your answers. First, falling in love. I'm bisexual and rather anti-marriage in general, but I met the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Here are some more. I met the love of my life, who happens to be the same gender as me, and we traveled from Texas to Chicago to get married. Seeing couples denied visitation and other access to their partner. I've been a lesbian since I was really young. My partner and I have been together for 35 years. My gay son's experience with bullying at school and how the high school staff handled his situation poorly. A coworker at my first job was the victim of homophobic bullying, and he confided in me. All of these are the seeds of stories about why you have chosen to get involved. They're powerful, meaningful experiences that actually happened, and we think that people need to hear about them. Anyone can talk about their experience. Anyone can tell their story. You don't have to be gay. You don't have to have a partner. You can be straight, you can be single. All you need is a belief in marriage equality. And by the end of this webinar, it's our hope that you'll be able to take that experience and use the tools we provide to craft your experience into a meaningful story and feel confident you can tell that story on your own. Now, take a few seconds and focus on what happened to you that made you want to become involved. Make sure it was a specific event that you actually experienced, that actually happened to you or to someone you know. Something specific that inspired you to get involved in the fight for LGBTQ equality. Now, it's important at this stage that you don't just focus on how you were feeling when you decided to get involved, though that is compelling. But we're looking for an event, something that actually happened, that lit that fire in your belly. Stories are action-driven. Something has to happen for the listener to be engaged. And keep the experiences personal. The listener should get a sense of the authentic you and be able to understand you and your motivation. Now, if you're having some difficulty thinking of a story, you may still be laboring under the mistaken notion, as I was, that what happened to you isn't interesting enough to hear, or that no one will care about what you have to say. But the truth is, we've been telling interesting stories since we were kids. We certainly heard stories as kids from our parents and our teachers, stories that taught us how to behave. And as kids, we shared stories with our parents all the time, like what happened at school or at football practice or rehearsal for the school play. Stories that gave our parents information about who we were becoming. And we're still telling stories. We tell our friends about the daily challenges we face at home, and we tell our partners about what a rough week it was at work, and they're engaged. They offer advice or help. We tell stories all the time, sometimes just for general information, but more often than not, we tell stories to get a response, to achieve an outcome. And do you have a story anyone will want to hear? You bet you do. You just have to be open to the possibility that you do. You need to have an open mind. Now, you may have heard that storytelling serves an important, powerful function in many areas of our lives. And indeed, we asked you, when you registered, why you think storytelling is important in a social justice movement. And here's what some of you had to say. 1, changing hearts and minds of real people makes all the difference. People are voters and judges and legislators and employers. They're decision makers. 2, connecting hearts and minds. There's that phrase again. 3, stories are a vehicle to show others how real our situations are and what an impact they make on society. 4, it's human nature to enjoy listening to stories, and by sharing the personal experiences we have had striving for marriage equality, we put a human face on the issue. 5, narrative is a powerful rhetorical device in U.S. culture. And 6, because they help demonstrate that LGBT people love just the same as straight people do, and there's no reason to delay giving LGBT people the same rights as all other people. Wow, you all really get it. Storytelling is powerful. And experts on the subject tell us very similar things. They say the shortest distance between two people is a story. They also tell us you're more likely to persuade someone to change their attitudes and minds if you connect with them. Stories don't simply say, these are my values. Stories demonstrate values, not as abstract principles, but as lived experiences. And this has the power to move people. Storytelling works when the people feel your values, when they sense they're seeing the real you. Now, leading storytelling expert Marshall Gans tells us, stories not only teach us how to act, stories inspire us to act. It's what we feel, not just what we know, that inspires us to act with courage. And stories make us feel, and people remember how they feel much longer than they remember things they're told. People retain far more detail about a story they hear than about facts and figures that are thrown at them. In other words, the best way to create the opportunity for someone to change their mind is to make them feel something by connecting with them. And a really effective way to connect with someone is to tell them a story. So I think we can agree that because the fight for LGBTQ equality is a social justice movement, stories also are one of the most powerful tools. The marriage equality movement has always been about people. During the years when so many laws were passed banning same-sex marriage, our movement was only engaging people's minds by talking about the facts about marriage equality. We were often hesitant to tell our personal stories of joy and sadness or pain and love that came with the denial of marriage to us, and to our children, and to our families. But we learned from these losses that folks respond best when we engage both their hearts and their minds. It's our personal stories of love and commitment, family, and change that everyone, supporters and opponents, can relate to. So we pushed ourselves to share these stories, both in everyday conversations with our friends, family, and coworkers, as well as more formally in the media as part of the campaign to win marriage. The results have been a continuous streak of winning campaigns for marriage equality. Now, this effect has extended into the courts as well. What judge could not feel compassion and empathy for Edie Windsor, talking about losing her soulmate of 4 decades, tragically to multiple sclerosis, only to be saddled with a $363,000 inheritance tax bill that no straight couple would have been ordered to pay? In their decisions supporting our cause, Justice Anthony Kennedy and others have repeatedly spoken of the stories of children harmed by denying their parents the freedom to marry. Judges are, after all, also human beings who are moved not just by the logic of the law, but by the humanity of those who are affected by the law. Some stories may remind them of someone they know or of them themselves. So, if we are winning in the courts and in the legislatures, why is storytelling still important? Well, because while these victories may guarantee the LGBT community the legal right to marry, The ability to exercise that right by living in communities that treat our families with dignity and respect is not something a law or a court decision can guarantee. The hearts and minds of people in the small towns, in the big cities, in remote rural areas must reflect that new legal reality in order for same-sex couples to live their freedom. This idea of lived equality for married same-sex couples can only be achieved in the hearts and minds of others. Unfortunately, the reality is that in many communities, in states both with and without marriage equality, there are many who still do not support marriage for same-sex couples. And this harms LGBT families' ability to live in dignity. But by continuing to reach out, tell our stories, and build understanding with others, we can change the hearts and minds of our communities and create a climate for both our legal and our lived equality. Think back to the landmark civil rights laws passed in the 1960s. We know that despite that legal equality, we must still work today to eliminate prejudice and discrimination, to create communities of lived equality. After marriage equality is the law of the land, we will need to continue this same kind of work to help people see that their concerns about the LGBT community in general and marriage equality specifically are unfounded. And no law can change that, but storytelling can. So we've developed this workshop to encourage and equip more of us to step forward and share our stories. Now, we want to take a look at what are the elements of a good story. I'd like you to listen to these two stories I'm about to tell. See if you think there are some common aspects to them. The events are very different, but listen for some commonality. Here's the first one. When I came out to my father in 1983, he wasn't happy. Then I met Bill, and we knew almost instantly that we would spend the rest of our lives together. My brothers and their wives were eager to meet Bill and loved him when they did. But my dad made excuse after excuse to avoid meeting Bill. And when he finally did meet Bill, he was cordial. He was polite. We never got anything more than that out of my dad. Then, when he was 40 years old, Bill was diagnosed with the same cancer my mother had died from many years earlier. When my dad saw how bravely Bill fought his disease, just like my mom had, and how fiercely I cared for Bill, just as my dad had cared for my mom, he began to understand that Bill and I were just like him. And when Bill died at age 52, just about the same age my mom was when she died, my dad was inconsolable. And 6 weeks before my dad died at age 90, he told me that he would look for Bill in heaven and tell him that I was okay. Now, here's another story. Janice and Lisa and their children traveled from Washington State to Florida to take a cruise for their family vacation. They were filled with excitement when they boarded the ship. And as they were exploring the ship, Lisa began to feel ill and then collapsed. The ship's staff rushed her off the ship to the nearest hospital. Janice gathered the children and their luggage and followed close behind. When Janice arrived at the hospital, she was informed that since she was not a relative, she would not be admitted to Lisa's room, nor would she be given any information about Lisa without a healthcare proxy or power of attorney. Now, this was before marriage equality was passed in Washington State, so Janice and Lisa were not legally married. But they had those documents, and Janice called home and had them faxed to the hospital. And still, the hospital staff refused to let Janice or the children see Lisa. Lisa died with her life partner, her spouse, her love, and her children so close, yet so far. And Janice and the children lost their love and their mother without being able to say goodbye. Now, both of these stories do involve tragic events, but it's not the sadness that makes them effective stories. It's not the tragedy that sparks a connection. It's this, and see if you had the same thoughts. These stories were descriptive. You could see the people in the different situations, and you can imagine yourself in the story. They make an emotional connection with the listener. You can relate to the people in the story and what happened to them, if not directly through common experience, then by having felt something similar in the past. And remember, we don't want to talk about how we feel, but we want the events we relate, the story we tell, to stir the listener's emotions. The story is authentic. It actually happened to you or to someone you know. And the story is to the point, with minimal extra detail or tangents. Now, a side note here, both of these stories have many more details that take much longer to tell, but as I told them just now, they were bare bones, no frills, and yet they still had the power to affect people. And notice also that the first story was told in the first person, and the second story was told in the third person, and both were powerful. You can tell your own story, or you can tell another person's story, and they can be equally effective. But now, think about your own event, your own experience of what lit a fire in your belly. Does it have some or all of these elements? And if not, do you think your story could have a greater impact if you added or expanded some of these elements? This will be something for you to think about as you craft your story. There are also some structural things to consider. Experts tell us that an effective story has a simple structure. 1. Before. Life is in balance. 2. A challenge throws life out of balance. 3. A choice is made. And 4. The outcome. Janice and Lisa's story is a perfect example of this structure. 1. Before. The family begins their vacation. Life is in balance. 2. Lisa collapses on the ship. A challenge throws life out of balance. 3. Janice rushes to the hospital. Janice obtains all the documents she was instructed to. A choice to act was made. 4. The outcome. Lisa dies alone. When you start working on your story, see if it follows this structure. Now, I've talked a lot about the what lit a fire in your belly story, or what we at Marriage Equality USA call the advocacy story. But there are other types of stories Marriage Equality USA has identified as useful in changing hearts and minds. There's the dialogue story. This is about an event that increased your appreciation of how important it is to have respectful dialogue, to share stories, and get to know others who, ideally, but not necessarily, oppose marriage equality. The story of change. This isn't about an event that led to a change in someone's views, a change in someone's heart from being less supportive to being more supportive of LGBTQ people and marriage equality. The story I told earlier about my dad's journey towards acceptance is a story of change. Then there's the marriage story. This is a story about you or someone you know. It talks about your dreams and your hopes for your life in a legally recognized marriage. Or it can be about how your life, or maybe the lives of your children, benefited from being legally married. It can also be about the harm experienced by couples who are prevented from marrying. You can even tell a story about the feelings you may have experienced when attending a wedding of a straight or gay couple. Marriage is marriage, after all, and we strive for the day we can eliminate gay marriage from our vocabularies. Now, think about these 4 types of stories. Think about whether you have a personal experience in each category that you can talk about. Now, you may not have one in every category, and that's okay. And don't worry if you can't immediately think of a story in every category in this short time. Sometimes a story pops into your head when you're not even thinking about it. And sometimes you need to sit quietly with your thoughts to identify if you have a certain type of story. And sometimes it takes talking it out with another person. In working with Marriage Equality USA, I was encouraged to come up with a dialogue story. This is because my colleagues know I tend to be a little impatient with people who just don't get it. I don't cut them very much slack. And as Tracy used to tell me, you're such a New Yorker. Well, I couldn't come up with a dialogue story, but she reminded me of an incident I had related to her earlier. Here it is. I became involved in the marriage equality movement here in New York State right before the right to marry was granted to same-sex couples. And the day after the New York State legislature passed its marriage equality bill, I attended my youngest nephew's high school graduation party. And when I walked in, my brother, my nephew's father, said, "So, did you get married last night?" I was furious. I took a breath and said, "No, I didn't get married last night because the man I would have married is dead." And I didn't speak to him for the rest of the night. Well, I quickly realized how seriously I overreacted. And when I got home, I said to myself, "Hey, calm down. Your brother is your best friend, and for years he's been your biggest advocate. Are you really going to be angry because he didn't say exactly what you wanted him to say when you wanted him to say it?" I realized that we do have to cut people some slack. My brother was probably unsure of what to say and defaulted to humor, ill-conceived though it may have been. I called my brother and I apologized for my reaction and acknowledged how he'd always been there for me. Being open-minded allowed us to get past this bump in the road and resume open, respectful dialogue. Now, you may have an emotionally meaningful story in all of these categories or just one. We encourage you to share as many types of stories as you're comfortable sharing. Now, once you've identified and crafted your story or stories, and you're ready to share them, remember that you want any person you tell your story to feel like they know you better and understand you. It's important to keep in mind the lessons from the dialogue story, that when you tell your story, you don't show judgment towards the people you're talking to, but rather that you build goodwill and put them at ease. You want them to feel safe around you, not threatened. And if you want to reach an audience, whether one person or many, it's important that they connect with you so that they can be receptive to your message. We don't want to put anyone on the defensive or make them feel that they're being judged or preached to. Rather, we want people to feel that they're being treated with consideration and care and respect, even if that may not be what we've received from them. We can all think of a time when we've disagreed with someone else, and haven't we all dug our heels in when we feel we're not being heard, when we felt judged or attacked? We want to make every effort to avoid doing that when we're talking to those who don't agree with us on the issue of marriage equality. There's a lot of wisdom out there about storytelling, and a lot of it is really helpful stuff. We've just reviewed some of the helpful pointers and guidelines. But don't let rules get in your way. You should only use the things that work for you. There's more than one way to discover a story and more than one way to tell it effectively. And you may have a story we didn't think of. Don't be afraid to tell it. The point is, just do it. No matter what you learn today, if you don't actually go out and share, none of it matters. We have to start talking. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many ways to start talking and many venues in which to talk. A great one is Getting to I Do, a website that allows people to share with others their stories of marriage. I invite you to visit the site and see what kinds of stories others have shared. And when you've written your own story and told it a few times, you may want to go back and edit it. See if you can incorporate more elements of strong storytelling or strengthen elements that are already there. And when you've got the story that you want, you can share it with a wider audience at Getting to I Do. So, when you registered for tonight's webinar, we also asked you what you hope to learn. Here's what some of you answered. How to share my story now that laws are changing in our favor. Always looking for additional tips on how to tell evolution stories. I would like to glean more experience and information in telling our story and making an impact on those who may not be on board with our equality. How to use narrative to change the minds of the uncommitted. How to share my story to have the most impact. I hope that what we've covered tonight has given you some of what you were hoping to find, and that you feel more empowered and better equipped to tell your stories. Whether it's on a stage in front of 100 people, or just talking to one person online at the supermarket. Whether it's in a private conversation with a coworker, or in the public via the media. Storytelling has no limits on its reach and no boundaries on where you can do it. The important thing is to let people know who we are and to help them change their hearts and minds. On behalf of Marriage Equality USA and Family Equality Council, I want to thank you for participating tonight. Good luck, and go tell a story.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I keep saying to Charlie, everyone, that his voice sounds like he should be on the radio. He talks and I don't know, it's just, you have a dreamy voice, Charlie. I want to thank everyone for joining us. As I expressed earlier, if you have any questions, in the right-hand column of your screen, right at the top, you'll see a square that has about 9 squares making one larger square. If you click on that, there's a Q&A little blue tab that you can click on and submit questions. Charlie, right now we have 3 questions that I'd like to run through with you. Do you mind answering a few questions with us with your dreamy voice?
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
Awesome, awesome. So you mentioned telling a story about a specific instance, so drilling your story down. Can you explain why it's important to stick with just one distinct moment rather than combining multiple situations, tying something together to try to make the story like the same, if you've experienced the same event over and over again, like discrimination, and you feel like they connect? Can you tell us why that one distinct story is better?
Well, I want to reiterate what I said near the end, is that if a rule isn't working for you, don't use it. But as I also said, there's a lot of wisdom out there. And the thing about sticking to one specific incident that actually happened applies more to the advocacy story than to anything. And the reason is that by avoiding talking about multiple events, you avoid diluting the story. One powerful, specific experience that you had will allow the audience to focus in on it and will allow them to feel one thing about it. The more events you talk about, the more the audience is going to focus on the one event, and then on the second, and then on the third, and they only have a limited capacity to take in. And it's the emotional response that you do really want, and that is often generated by one strong central story.
Awesome. Awesome. So in this regard of being able to tell a story either from a first person or a third person standpoint, is it bad when you're telling a story to, say, if I experienced something and my girlfriend was there with me and I remember how she felt? Or I remember if I had my child with me and I remember how they felt. Should I still stick to first person and just describe how I feel versus identifying the other people's story? Does that take away from the impact?
Well, again, I'll always stress this about the rules. Use the ones that work. However, what I said early on was you really don't want to talk about how you or someone else felt. Because what you do when you do that is you limit the audience's options for how they may feel. Because if you talk about being angry, you know, which I kind of did in my dialogue story, but that's another issue, then the audience gets in an anger mode, and that may not be as authentic for them as if you left the menu open for them to have their own authentic experience. So by talking about how any of the characters in the story felt, you limit, as I said, you limit the range of emotions that the audience can feel. And something that they feel themselves is always more powerful than something that they're even passively told to feel.
That makes a lot of sense. So in keeping with that, when selecting your story, you identified four. So I definitely would like you to just touch on those again for those that joined us a little later, if you don't mind doing that. But when you are selecting your story, are there other factors that you should consider aside from the 4-point structure?
Um,
Like
well, with respect to the size of the group, do you mean, or whether you're talking
yeah,
to?
so like if it's a large audience, I know you mentioned adjusting, but what should I adjust? Should I adjust the tone? Well, just give us some more insight pertaining to large groups, small groups, age range potentially if you're
Sure.
talking to a
I'm not
group,
sure
a
that any.
one-on versus anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure that any of those variables really matter, except to the extent that they affect what it is you're trying to do. Because you'll remember when I talked about how we've been telling stories since we were children, I say sometimes we just do it for general information, but a lot of times we're telling our parents about that trouble we're having with the teacher because we want the parents to
Right.
do something about it. It's not just I've got nothing better to say. Usually when we tell stories, there's a reason we're telling it. And I think that the reasons can be the same whether you're speaking to 100 people or whether you're speaking to one person. And so the goal, the ultimate goal is what you should focus on, and that will tell you what kind of story to tell. And here's kind of an interesting example. Brian Silva, the executive director of Marriage Equality USA, asked me last May if I would speak at the New York Gala fundraiser. And I asked him what he wanted me to do. And he said, well, I'd like you to do the additional ask for money. And I said, oh, Brian, you don't really want me to do that because I suck at asking for money. And he said, okay, don't ask for money, just tell your story. And I figured I was going to be speaking to this big room full of people who all supported marriage equality. So I was going to tell them, because I'm an angry New Yorker, about hearing that this rhetoric that LGBT people cheapen the institution of marriage. And I thought to myself, really, when Governor Spitzer of New York is visiting prostitutes, and Governor Schwarzenegger of California is fathering children with the maid, and John Edwards has illegitimate children, and Newt Gingrich is trading up sick wives every chance he gets, and we cheapen marriage? And Brian said, well, yeah, that's good, but don't tell that story. He said, tell your father's story. And in a slightly longer version, I told the story that night that I told here. Brian didn't need anger in the room that night at politicians.
Right.
He needed them to feel sympathetic and empathetic, so they would part with the money he hoped they'd part with. And we raised a considerable amount of money on that one story. And so that brings me back to the point about the decision as to what story you're telling relates directly to your purpose in telling it. And you're really the only one who will know why you're telling a story on any given occasion.
Awesome. I got a question about being cut off while you're telling a story. So I'm going to assume that this person is speaking about one-on-one interactions. So do you have any advice, since you're such a New Yorker, on the best way to approach someone that may cut you off?
One of the liabilities of this format is that I can't engage the person asking the question in dialogue to find out exactly what they meant. But I think this probably speaks to the issue we raised at the very end about respectful dialogue, even if that's not what you're getting from the people you're speaking to. Because some people's minds are never going to change. But they will definitely not change if you're aggressive and abusive. And so if that person is, hang back, don't allow yourself to be abused, certainly, but wait for an opportunity to speak and then try to pick up the thread of your conversation. But certainly matching their intensity with intensity of your own isn't really going to get us where we want to go with respect to changing hearts and minds. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. I think it does. Charlie, another question I would like to ask, and if you aren't sure, then I will accept that as well. You reiterated lived in legal equality, and you've also reiterated changing hearts and minds. Can you kind of speak to how changing hearts and minds works both for lived and legal equality? And that may be very simplistic, but I think it helps to highlight that.
Yeah, no, I think I do have an answer to that question. And again, this is not my own wisdom. This is working, what I've learned working with the wonderful people at Marriage Equality USA. We spoke about Justice Anthony Kennedy and how he was affected by Edie Windsor's story. These are people who are decision makers. These are people in power, and they are just as vulnerable or sensitive to effective storytelling as anyone else. And so there's that. But then there's people on the ground, people on the street, people in the supermarket who if you can change their hearts and minds by telling them a story about your son who was bullied because he was gay, or a coworker who suffered because they were gay, maybe when that person goes home and an LGBT couple moves in next door, maybe that person will be less likely to be abusive and a little bit more likely to be supportive and cordial, allowing this couple to live their life peacefully.
Awesome. Awesome. So I want to just go ahead and almost somewhat wrap on the note of how family equality uses stories. We are currently seeking stories to supply to the Supreme Court in our amicus briefs. We've submitted our Voices of Children amicus briefs in every circuit court, and we highlight the voices of children. We found that highlighting the stories of the children and the inequality and the feelings that they have about their parents not being able to marry has certainly changed hearts and minds. Judge Richard Posner in the Seventh Circuit expressly highlighted that it was the amicus briefs and that changed his mind, and he was a Republican Reagan appointee. So I definitely wanted to acknowledge that. I want to reiterate that Marriage Equality USA, if you all are interested in fully developing your story, or if you want to share your story publicly online, we invite you to sign up with Marriage Equality USA's Getting to I Do project. In addition to webinars, including an expanded version of this one, you can request a seasoned story catcher to help you develop your story and record it, and even post it to the Getting to I Do website. So for those of you that may not have gotten all of the elements or have a few more questions that unfortunately you weren't able to get in and ask Charlie, Marriage Equality USA has story catchers that can work with you. So folks are taking on a rolling basis as space is available. So if you're interested, you can email Marriage Equality USA, and we will send you that link after the webinar. On behalf of the Family Equality Council, our Executive Director, Mr. Gabriel Blau, our wonderful programs team that put this together, and our friends over at Marriage Equality, the Executive Director, Mr. Brian Silva, and our presenter this evening, Mr. Charles, excuse me, Charlie, I did not mean to call you Charles, Charlie Scatamacchia, and I enjoy saying your name now that I am saying it correctly. I'd like to thank you for attending. Charlie, thank you so much for your wonderful, dreamy voice and for putting this together. If you would like to share your story with either of the organizations, please feel free to visit the marriageequality.org website and or familyequalitycouncil.org. If you log on to the familyequality.org website, you are able to share your story under our Get Informed tab, our Get Involved tab, and we look forward to hearing from you. We ask that you check in on our site to check out our next webinar, and we'll form in this exact same way. We'll get online and have an awesome conversation with an awesome presenter, just as Charlie has been tonight. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next time, in theory. See you next time.